All right, welcome everyone to our session. I hope you had a fun time with the sponsor expo. So we're starting our session with Where Research Begins. And today's session is brought to you by Inspira Vantage, an admissions accounts consulting firm with extensive experience in helping students get into their graduate programs, and with scholarships as well as AHDPG, a premier provider of healthcare documentation training and certification. And I'm honored to talk about our speakers today. Dr. Christopher Ray is a professor of Asian Studies and former director of Center for Chinese Research at the University of British Columbia. He has been a visiting fellow at Harvard University along with universities in Taiwan and Australia. Furthermore, Dr. Ray has published many works, including Where Research Begins with Dr. Mullaney. Dr. Tom Mullaney is a professor of Chinese history at Stanford University. His published works have been featured in BBC, The Atlantic, and has been in invited lectures at Google, Adobe, and Microsoft, as well as others. He is the other co-author of Where Research Begins. Please welcome both Dr. Ray and Dr. Mullaney.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here. We're delighted to be here, and we're going to be jumping right into sharing two exercises, two strategies that you can use to figure out what to do research on. So I'm going to turn things over to Tom, and we're going to get rolling with a couple of things that we've learned from our 20 plus years of experience in research.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers for having us. It's been a real delight and incredibly impressive to see something of this magnitude pulled off with such ease. So we're going to be talking about the idea of where a research project, a meaningful research project, begins. And we make the case in the book that we published on University of Chicago Press that you save a lot of time in the long run of your research when you take a little time at the beginning of the process or wherever you are to do some deep figuring out and introspective work about why it is that you are working on what you are working on. So the question that is just second nature in all of our, we come from the humanities, but it really doesn't matter. In STEM fields, we know it's exactly the same. What do you work on is the standard way of greetings at coffees or new student orientations, especially as you climb into higher degrees, as you move forward. And typically what one hears to this question, what do you work on, is some variety of what you see here. So a person might say, you know, they work in comparative literature. I work on dystopian fiction, but coming from the health sciences or biological sciences or elsewhere, it might be I work on schizophrenia, stigma, or the role of art in social movements, reproductive justice, something of this nature. And this way of announcing one's identity is, of course, essential. You know, when you're going around the table, you have to be economical. It's also a way to be impressive and to feel like you have a stable scholarly identity. The problem is that none of these descriptions about what one works on in any way tells other people what's actually going on in their research. Or another way to put it is you could imagine 100 people with radically different research problems, the thing that motivates them to undertake their research. You could imagine 100 different people all giving the exact same answer to this question, I work on reproductive justice, but it leaves unanswered the question of why or how or in what way. And so what we focus on a lot and what the exercises we're going to introduce here are all about is about getting from topics and cases, these things that we have to have, of course, in research, but to dig down and to figure out what is the problem that underlies that question. A problem can have many different manifestations or case studies. And the same case study, depending on the scholar, can have many problems that sort of motivate and underlie it. So a problem is something you go to bed thinking about, you wake up thinking about. It's a deeply personal and persistent thing. And the sooner that a scholar can figure out, the reason that I work on X is because I have a particular problem with Y. The sooner that one can come to that realization, the sooner they gain sort of superpowers as a scholar in all sorts of different ways. So a problem is different than a case or a topic because it deals more with the question of, why is this an existential irritant to me? Why am I concerned about this amidst the infinite number of things that I could be interested in as a scholar? So the first thing that we need to focus on is this notion that your problem, whatever your problem is as a researcher, and we trust that every human being has a particular problem they bring into their work, is not a topic. And so the first exercise, which Chris is going to introduce, gets at that in sort of closer detail. It's called change one variable. Chris, walk us through it.
So change one variable is very powerful because it helps you figure out what is essential, what really has to be in your project, and what, you could change that variable. You could take something out and you would be equally interested or maybe even more interested in the project. And this is really important because we often get stuck, right? It's easy to get stuck in your case and feel like, if I can't do the research on my case, I have no project. So this is a real life example from an actual student who came to Tom in this case and said, I'm interested in doing research on child abuse in Cambodia in the 1960s. So you can see there's some very obvious variables here. There is the thing, right? The subject or object, child abuse. We have a place, Cambodia, and we have a time, 1960s. So this is a very kind of simple, there are just only 3 variables in this thing. But if somebody kind of came and said, this is what I want to work on, you'd say, of course, that's really important. But you may not know why, and you may also not know how they want to go about doing this. So if you start with one variable, let's say we changed it to adult male violence in Cambodia in the 1960s, would you hypothetically be equally interested in working on this, less interested, or more interested? And the key here is, if you go through this for yourself or with a research partner, they have to be completely honest, right? They cannot lie to you and pretend that they are equally interested in something else. So let's say in this case, the student said, I'm not as interested in adult male violence as I am in child abuse. So the question comes up immediately, why? Why does one speak to you and the other does not? And so this is something that is a really key moment in the process where you have to be honest with yourself and say, as a human being, I may be equally interested. As a researcher, I feel like, adult men can protect themselves and children are more vulnerable. So I'm really more interested in vulnerable populations. And immediately you have produced a new type of evidence. And so the person who's talking to you about, has a new revelation and say, well, if you're interested in vulnerable populations, if that's where your problem lies, you might be equally interested in elder abuse in Cambodia in the 1960s. So in this particular case, the student said, yes, indeed, I'm equally interested in elder abuse and child abuse. This does not mean that they now have 2 projects, but now they can really ask themselves the question of why. Why are these things of equal interest to them? So you don't stop here. Then you can try changing other variables and just do it one at a time in the first instance. So let's say you changed it from Cambodia to Canada, and the answer came back, I'm not as interested in the Canadian case as I am in the Cambodian case. You're comparing different cases. And again, you want to be honest. Why? Why is Canada not as important? So this particular student said, I think it's because Cambodia is a post-colonial place, and I feel like the kind of politics and history influence the experience of vulnerable populations in a way that they don't in Canada. They may be right, they may be wrong, but the point of this exercise is to produce this type of evidence where you can understand the problem that is within the particular case. And then you can link that case to other potential cases that deal with the exact same problem.
Yeah, and that's and that particular student, after that conversation, I was able to then tell that student, in addition to the Cambodia section of the library, you should probably also read this or that leading African-American history scholar who works on legacies of the transatlantic slave trade, on family dynamics in Detroit in the 1960s. And that's something that as scholars, if you are fixed to your case or your topic, you would never dream of going to that part of the library because you're stuck in topic land. You're stuck in your case study, and you're not actually finding the fellow travelers, the other scholars, the other researchers who share your problem. And so suddenly a little bit of work on the front end saves a lot of time on the back end. Now, another exercise, that exercise from the book is one of the more complex, but it's also probably the most powerful. The one we're about to introduce is much more straightforward, and it's called Go Small or Go Home. We also nickname it Ask Meaningless Questions. And so before I introduce it, let's explain why it is that you would want to work on this. So one thing that we've found is brilliant questions across all fields, humanities, social sciences, STEM, pre-medical, it doesn't matter. Brilliant questions don't in fact come from brilliant people. Like a genius question is not something that a genius asks. Instead, a genius question is a question that perhaps hundreds of thousands of people are taking notice of when they read the secondary literature or the primary literature. But one of those persons, that of 100,000, actually gives themselves the permission and the authorization to pursue that line of inquiry. So here's an example from economics. If anyone here has ever heard, I'm sure, of the sort of economic theory of shrinkflation, that is the form of inflation that is achieved not by increasing the prices of goods, but by quietly reducing the amount of a particular good that a manufacturer makes for you. So basically putting a little bit less cereal in the cereal box and then charging the exact same amount of money. Well, chances are really, really good that thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people had the following really silly observation as they were eating some potato chips one day. And it goes like this. Does this potato chip feel a little lighter than like historical potato chips? There's something different about this. That is an act of noticing something in the world that is giving you pause, that you're taking notice of. And those moments in life are precious. They are invaluable. And yet, despite how invaluable you are, you would be amazed at the number of people who just leave it behind, who just sort of move on. They say, that's a silly question. If I say that out loud, people will probably kick me out of the program. I sound so stupid. Or I'm sure someone has looked into this, and who am I to bother? Well, the person who actually bothered to have this noticing, does this Pringle chip feel different? Does this cereal box feel lighter? Then pursued that, gave themselves permission to do that, and lo and behold, discovered that yes, there is an entirely new form of inflation called shrinkflation now, which is, of course, a mainstay now of economic thought. So that's not an act of genius. That's an act of giving yourself permission to notice what you are noticing. So back to the meaningless questions idea. The goal of this is that when you are in the presence of a primary source, whatever a primary source is in your subdiscipline or field, it might be a data set, it might be ethnographic work, it might be interactions with patients, it could be MRIs, it could be any number of things. For us, it's archival documents, textual sources. Whatever it is to train your mind to ask and be able to ask dozens, if not hundreds of questions of anything that you throw and put in front of yourself with the following requirement. One, you cannot try to impress anybody. So the goal is not to have someone hear you ask questions and say, oh my goodness, this person is really smart and really deserves to be in this program. Like, wonderful. Your goal is not to impress anybody, imaginary or real. And the second part of meaninglessness is that you are not limited in the questions you ask by the nature of the source. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So just to give you a kind of a quick introduction, you can take, I'm going to show you a photograph. This is from the realm of history, but it really doesn't matter. The training is exactly the same. And I'm going to give you 60 seconds and use the chat if you have that access. I think you all do, to ask as many meaningless, silly, naive questions as possible. I'm going to start with the first 5 seconds just to get the pump priming, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. 3, 2, 1. The only thing I'll tell you is this is a photograph taken at the trial of Nuremberg, the trial of Nazi Germany in the wake of World War II. And one question might be, what is that guy with the white helmet doing in the background? Why are they facing each other in this building? Why are some people wearing headphones? Now you take it over. 60 seconds on the clock. Go. Just throw it into the chat. Don't worry.
What diagram are they presenting? When is this? Why is his belt white? What fabric were those curtains made out of? Who is the speaker? Who is on trial?
What hotel did they stay in at the nighttime? How many days did it last? What language is everyone speaking? If you find it difficult to ask questions, what is the camera that was used? So again, you don't have to make this all about Nazi Germany. What camera was being used? What chemicals were used at that time for the processing of film? What is the standard format? Is it 3x5 for this era of film? Go on. Where's the electrical grid? Is this AC current or DC current? What kind of tree is that? Are those tables made out of? What wood is that made of? What is the temperature in the room? Is there air conditioning? And if you find yourself unable to get past 10 questions or 5 questions, that means that your kind of cognitive range of motion, kind of like in a very physical way of, joint range of motion, is too narrow, and you need to go back to the meaningless question gym over and over and over again. And also, if all the questions you're asking are about Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany, Nazi Germany, and you can't get to those more meta or orthogonal questions of what is the kind of film that's being used, and what is the processing technique of the film, and what is the material out of which that helmet is made, again, you want to work on your range of motion. So fantastic work. You can do this, and I do this with my students at the beginning of every lecture. On the midterm, they have to do this. And it does not matter if the source comes from your neck of the woods or not. In fact, the weirder and more distant a source is, the better. And what you are training yourself to do is to notice different things. So for example, you are with a source. Let's say it's a source that you actually care about. So not something that Mulaney just threw up there or Ray threw up there. You generate a list of 100 meaningless questions. Well, you now have 2 forms of evidence at your disposal. One is you have already started taking notes about the primary source, which of course you have to do, but you're also taking notes about what's going on in your own mind. You're taking note of what you are noticing. And depending on the pattern of what you as a scholar are noticing, as opposed to any number of other people who might do this exercise, then your very next step might be radically different than someone else. So let's say that you did fixate on that diagram in the background. It's like, what is data visualization before the computational age? Maybe I'm interested in like the prehistory of data visualization, not Nazi Germany. Well, if that's true, then the very next book you should read has nothing to do with World War II. It's W.E.B. Du Bois's, the great Black political thinker, activist, and so forth. W.E.B. Du Bois's Data Portraits. It's basically a history of W.E.B. Du Bois's data visualizations. Maybe that's what you should read next. But if you kind of were worried about what the women are doing in the front, why are there only so many women? Why is the shape of this room the way it is? Maybe you would want to read something about ethnographies of stenograph typists in law firms, or how the spatial architecture of courthouses influences basically legal justice. Maybe that's the next thing. These are radically different pathways, but you don't know what's next until you start to see, what am I noticing? And let me train myself to really stretch my range of movement, and to give myself permission to notice whatever it is that my brain is leading me to. Okay. So the key here then, and we'll close it and we'll start with Q&A, is that your problem is not a topic. It needs your permission to explore it. And then there are, of course, different dimensions, which we cover at greater length in the book. So we're about at 20 minutes. We're asked to speak about 25 minutes. We want to turn it out immediately. I'm going to stop share here. And let's hear what's on your mind and what happened for you with those 2 exercises, one of which, of course, we did and one we didn't. Oh, I can finally see the chat. These are awesome. Is there a mole informant in the room? This is awesome. Why are there mostly men? What are they
Who's
planning?
the youngest person in the room?
Who's the youngest person? Exactly. Male versus female. Why is there a random desk in front of the diagram? Now, what I want to just underscore here is, I don't know, this is Oscar. Oscar asked this question. I take that Oscar's question was sincere, but the interesting thing is I've had students in my classes who do this exercise, and they're trying to make like other students in the class laugh. They're trying to like be irreverent and be the class clown. And they end up asking brilliant questions. And it's like, well, I know you were trying to like, I don't know, muck up the works, Frank, but that question you asked is actually genius. And so let's pursue why it's genius. So this is about putting aside meaningfulness and trying to impress anybody and getting to the job of noticing. But what's some questions to throw in the chat or by the YouTube stream? Let's get going.
Yeah, so one of our first questions to ask is a little bit more about the research process, like getting into research. So what are some tips for someone who's interested and they were like, I want to get involved in research? What's their first step?
First step can really be just to write down for yourself, not necessarily for anyone else, what you're curious about, to kind of make your own list of interests and curiosities. Again, you don't have to share this with anyone, but just so that you have a record of, at this moment in time, what do I think I'm interested in? And the reason to write that down is because that's definitely going to change. As you get into sources, as you talk to authorities, as you read what other scholars and researchers have written, it's impossible to kind of recapture that originary moment. And so really the more that you can write of your own kind of self-evidence, of just kind of printing out your brain or your heart at that moment, that is a fantastic way to start. And that's not just something that's going to help you at the beginning. You're going to be able to go back and use that again and again as you get more knowledgeable in the research process.
Great. Someone asked, once you're able to put aside kind of like the activity we did with like meaningless questions, how do you take that broader understanding and make it specific to narrowing it down to a topic?
Yeah. So let's just take meaningless questions, for example, as a method. After one has really pushed themselves, I mean, really beyond the breaking point, just whenever you feel like that's enough, it's never enough. And you really push, because it's that 40th, that 60th question that something can happen. And something we talk about in the book a lot is this metaphor of the EKG, that, you know, as you're doing your work in the beginning stages of research, really throughout, but especially the beginning, you got to imagine you're just like plugged into this thing that's reading your body, and it's paying attention to even the slightest tremors of interest. And so in the process of reading any primary source, any secondary source, and all of the notes that you yourself produce, you want to split your focus. One eye is sort of reading whatever it is you're reading, and the other eye is looking at the needle on the machine to see, is something happening in me? Is my needle jumping when I come to this? And so what ends up happening is you produce this really, 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 really long list of meaningless questions. And then you plug yourself back into that EKG and you reread your own list of questions. It becomes what we call a form of self-evidence. It's sort of a play on words. But then you're reading your own questions. Many of them will just be, for lack of a better word, BS. Like, I had to do it, so I thought of it, I thought of it, I thought of it, I thought of it. But one of them, guaranteed, one of them, you're going to reread what you yourself wrote, and you're going to look over in the corner, and that needle is going to go boop, and you're going to say, and that's, you have to notice that. Just like the Pringle chip, the potato chip, you have to notice when your needle jumps. And then you read through your list more, nothing, I just thought of it, that's neat, but I don't care. And then another question that you yourself produced, boop, wait a minute. And you want to take note of which ones are making your needle jump. So out of 100 questions, you might get 8, 9, 10 that do that for you. Then what you do is you take those 8, 9, 10 questions, you sort of sequester them over to their own part of the page, the paper, and write all this stuff down. And you look at the 8 questions that made your needle jump from the photograph of the Nuremberg trial or whatever. And you say, wow, okay, there seems to be kind of a pattern here. I was asking about the wood. I was asking about the material out of which the flags were made. I was asking about the material out of which the helmet was made. I'm kind of like a budding material scientist. But someone else might have asked all about gender or race or political economy or electricity and so you have this mirror of what's kind of happening at a very subtle level. And again, if it turns out that the pattern of questions that jump your needle are about materiality or gender, or about where did these people sleep at night after the trial was over, that informs what the very next thing you should read is, or the very next professor you should reach out to or colleague. Very different depending upon which pattern it is. That is the process by which, in other words, people narrow down their topic. We are big advocates against that language, but this is a process by which naturally you're starting to hone in on something that matters to you, and then you make it matter to the world.
Great. Thank you so much for that really detailed answer. So we had a question that is about now moving on to approaching a professor, and you have questions interested in their field, but you don't have any prior experience working with their field. So how do you get started with connecting with this professor to kind of talk about a little bit more?
I think a fantastic way of connecting with any other researcher is if you say, I'm interested in X, they'll naturally wonder, how did that research interest develop, or how did that curiosity develop? So if you have a thing like an article that you read or a source that you found, share it with them. Share it with them so that they can understand your frame of reference, because this is really a key way of empowering them to help you better. So if you say, like, I'm interested in democracy, or I'm interested in justice, they'll be like, well, I am too, but I don't understand how your particular reading experience or life experience has led you to that really broad interest. And so if you can bring them the specific thing that was like the catalyst for you, or maybe there are several catalysts, like I've been reading all of these books, then they can understand where you're coming from, and then they can respond more effectively. So same thing when you're talking with someone else and you're trying to help them. Don't be polite. Ask, where did that interest come from? What was it for you that brought you here? And that is a great way to begin a conversation. So you don't have to sound smart. You don't have to use big words, no buzzwords. Just be honest and forthcoming about where you are coming from.
Thank you. So pertaining, because we do have a college audience, like just starting, what is like the best time of the year during college if you're interested in research to kind of get involved in?
I would say, I think sooner rather than later is always key. And I think that there are many fields, and I think that STEM is actually far more advanced and far more admirable than than humanities and social sciences, which tends to save research as if it's this like prize that you can only unlock after you've gone through however many levels of the game of college. And I think first year, as soon as humanly possible, you want to have the kind of conversation that Chris just said. And to really underscore it, the thing that kills those conversations, not because the professor's not happy to see you. Professors are so happy to see you in office hours, you wouldn't believe it, and so sad when they're just sitting there by themselves. They're like really, really, truly sad. And just like, where is everybody? I'm here for you. But the thing that kills those conversations is when the student is understandably, but trying to perform intelligence, almost as if they're reapplying to the college that they're already in, as if they're afraid they're going to be kicked out. And I understand this, and I would never say like, don't worry, because that's terrible advice. But the key is that you don't need to reapply to the college that has already accepted you, the university has already accepted you. You really want to go into that meeting, like Chris said, and you have to be able to be vulnerable by sharing what was the moment or the instance in which something occurred to you. And something that we talk about in the book is it's a very short vignette, but it's a student who came to me and said, I want to write a paper about geomancy, about feng shui in Chinese society. And to cut the long story short, the beginning, she tried to sort of impress me with her vocabulary and say, this is about a filling in the gap and modernity and da. And what it really boiled down to, after I left enough space for her to feel okay to be vulnerable, is she said, listen, my mom's a lawyer. She's the most rational person I have ever met in my entire life. And she believes in this. And I don't get that. That the moment she said that, I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to kick this person out of Stanford. That's too petty or something. Was okay. now we can actually start having a conversation about research, because I kind of get what you're talking about. But before, it was just like a cloud of SAT words, and professors, no matter who they are, they can't use that to figure out how to guide a person. That's the real key. But as soon as possible, have that conversation.
Thank you for providing such a good insight on just how to have a conversation. I think there's like anxiety, a little bit intimidation in the beginning, but it's good to hear that professors want to hear what you're talking about. So in terms of research project, how long does a good research project actually like take?
Boy, you'd be surprised. It doesn't have to be a 200-page, tome. Especially, I began research in high school. It was just an independent study project. I don't think it produced a voluminous work. So you can start early. And what I've discovered, working with high school students, college students, graduate students, sometimes they actually think they need to do more than they really need to do. And they do add on kind of a lot of this padding language that Tom was talking about, of big buzzwords, without kind of focusing in on what are the essential questions here, and what is the motivating problem. And that's one of the reasons that we have all of these exercises that are trying to clarify what is the problem, because actually that becomes a tool that you can use to pare down and to actually save yourself a lot of work. And just to give one specific example, if that student had come to Tom and said, like, I'm interested in feng shui, and Tom just says, okay, just go read all of the books about feng shui, that student would just be buried in tons of readings, books and articles and everything on the topic possible. And they could do a very dutiful, competent job of summarizing all of that research. But it doesn't matter what your field is. You may well find yourself in that situation where a well-meaning advisor is saying, I want to help your research by giving you an exhaustive reading list on your topic. But that can be a trap. So you really want to be aware that, when I go to a conference in my field, I'm not going to every single panel. I'm not equally interested in everything, because I understand my problem is in some papers, but not in others. And so if you can, again, hone to your problem, you're going to be able to cut down just to the essentials. So there's no like arbitrary page count or word count in a research project. You may get those for some assignments, and those can be a tool to help you try to focus your energies and to articulate your ideas in the most economical fashion. But don't think that you have to produce a massive work to be doing real research.
Great. It's really nice to hear, since we had a lot of similar questions about a research project starting your own. So more pertaining to a specific type of research, bench work, so more wet lab research. What are some platforms you would recommend students who are interested in wet lab look into to kind of get into trying out what wet lab research looks like?
Well, I mean, we come, just as a background, we come from outside of the biological sciences. So that's the, but let me back up the question just for a second and kind of introduce the way we think about research cross-disciplinarily, because obviously we come from humanities fields. We train our students from beginning to at very advanced levels in very, very specific methodologies that are not relevant to all fields. And that's true of every field. There is every subfield, every field has dozens and dozens of incredibly good introductions to the specific methodologies necessary for that field, be it, statistical analysis, qualitative analysis, whether machine learning, all the way to what Chris and I sort of came together to work on. We worked on this book in secret for like 16 years before we finally revealed it to the world. What this book is, in essence, is, does anyone remember when you were about 4 or 5 years old and there's all of this cool stuff on the countertop of the kitchen or on the table, and it's like just out of reach, and it's like this whole world that grandma and grandpa or parents are keeping away from you just by virtue of this distance. It's not like the top of Mount Everest. It's not it's just a little bit out of reach. Then comes the moment in every child's life when they figure, if I just grab a stool or a dining room chair and push it up against the counter, boom, I got it, because I can climb that step and then I'm on. The countertop is, in this metaphor, is field specific research. There's like all of this amazing stuff to do. This is just a whole life and all these worlds up there, and a lot of really, really good introductions to how to do it. The chair in this metaphor is, how do I try to figure out what it is that I care about? Because every one of those research methodology books that exist basically assume that the researcher already knows what their question is, and now they just need my help as the author to know how to answer that question. And what you discover is that that's true, you need those methods, but 99.9% of all scholars do not know how to figure out what their question even is. And so when they start looking at those method books, they get very lost very fast. Or the other thing that happens, which is equally scary, is they get started, they're starting, they're on a lab, they're working, and then every day they feel more and more bored. They feel more and more disconnected from the work. And then they come to what is the worst possible realization in the world. They say to themselves, I guess this is just what it's like. I guess I'm not supposed to be in love with this. I guess this is just how it is. And I just have to accept that research really isn't all that great. Oh gosh. That's when I've met many students who have reached that conclusion because they either skipped that first step or were never introduced to the idea of really figuring out what it is. So I just wanted to bring it back to that particular point.
Perfect. Thank you for having such a good insight on just what the research is like, and talking about how it can seem like just far away from the distance. So I think we have time for one last question. And I think this is just about, when we talk about research, there's always funding is something that's thrown around. And someone asked, how do you get funding for research? Like, what is the grant applying process that we hear professors or like PIs talk about?
I'll say a few words and then I'll turn things over to Tom so he can give his answer. So in this book, we encourage, there's a lot of discussion you have to have with yourself, where you have to not use the buzzwords. You have to say what you mean to yourself. In applying for grants, it's a slightly different type of conversation because you're trying to please an external judge, which can actually be fatal, trying to please an external judge early in the research process. If you have not taken stock of what you really care about and you're just trying to kind of reconcile with the interests of your field or discipline. When it comes to applying for funding, you do have to talk the talk. You do have to speak to these people. And you do need to project, like a grant application is a forward-looking statement where you are trying to make suppositions about what you are going to do in the future. And you're always doing this before you're fully ready. So you don't have complete knowledge, right? You're saying, bet on me because of my potential. And you do need strategies to be able to signal that you have done some preliminary research, that you have a keen interest, you have some of the technical skills and qualifications. But if you are an undergraduate or if you're in high school, I would start by talking to some of your mentors, talking to people who are successful grant applicants, talk to the undergraduate research office for guidance on what types of research opportunities are available. So start by talking with them, and then they will help to guide you. We actually on our website even are going to have some suggestions on grant applications. This is something we talk about in chapter 3 on how to actually create a viable project that takes into account all of the practicalities. But talk to your advisors in your institution and then take things from there. What would you say, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, we divide, I know that no one has seen the book, but we divide the book into really the first part, which is about all of the work that we have focused on in this conversation. But then the second part of the book is called Get Over Yourself, which is that first you figure, the book is called Where Research Begins, Choosing a Research Project That Matters to You, and then in parentheses, and the world. So it starts with figuring out a project that matters to you. And I mean, really matters. I mean, it is something that is like part of your personhood, But then comes the process of translating that into language that people in your field and others can understand and that they will give you money for. And but the great thing is that that's the place where, after having practiced meaningless questions and being vulnerable and not trying to sound too impressive to all your professors and all of that anxiety, now you get to turn all that back on. You get to say, okay, anxiety, come back into the room, and come on, vocabulary, come on, like reapply to college, all of that skill, come back. I need you now. But now all of that intelligence, all of that performance of intelligence is now in service of you. It's actually in service of the thing that you now know you care about. And that's like a perfect marriage. That's like, the horses are pulling in one direction. The thing you want to avoid is getting into the trap of performing your intelligence so consistently that one day you wake up in a sweat and you realize, I am successful and absolutely hollow. I am successful and I am a million miles away from anything I truly care about. That's a very, very scary feeling. And so what we really want for all of you and every researcher is those two things in alignment. Because once those two things are in alignment, there is simply no experience in life as fulfilling as research. It's one of the top 3 most fulfilling things that one can do, is to really be doing that. So when you get to the grant application phase, you turn all of that intelligence, all that performance back on, and now it's in service of getting you the money.
Perfect. That was really, really, really powerful, saying that you don't want to be successful and but feel hollow. But we had such a great presentation. So everyone, please transition to our next session with physical therapy and occupational therapy. And thank you so much, Dr. Ray and Dr. Mooney.
Thanks so much.
Coming to talk about research.
Thank you.